The Nexus Prime Banking Consortium's flagship vault facility hung in the void like a chrome-plated middle finger extended toward the concept of theft itself. 3 kilometers of reinforced trilithium hull wrapped around enough defensive systems to make a dreadnought weep with envy. All of it orbiting the economic heart of the galaxy with the smug confidence of something that had never been successfully robbed. Which, to be entirely fair, it hadn't. Yet, inside the facility's nerve center, a collection of the galaxy's most paranoid security minds gathered around a holographic display that would have given lesser beings seizures. The Vorthak representative, a creature that looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a tax auditor, clicked its mandibles in what passed for satisfaction among its species. "The intercepted communications are quite clear," it announced, its translator rendering the chittering into crisp standard. "The human criminal organization intends to breach our perimeter at 0300 hours local time." A dendrite security chief, whose bark-like skin had turned the particular shade of brown that indicated either deep thought or digestive distress, rustled its leaves dismissively. Predictable, humans always favor the direct approach. No subtlety whatsoever. The other council members rippled with what might charitably be called agreement, though it sounded more like the kind of noise one makes when stepping in something unpleasant. The evidence was admittedly overwhelming. 3 separate intelligence networks had picked up chatter about a massive heist operation. The human criminals had been refreshingly unsubtle about their intentions, purchasing military-grade plasma cutters, hiring demolition experts, and even going so far as to rent a fleet of assault shuttles. It was the sort of planning that made security professionals simultaneously grateful and slightly insulted by its obviousness. "They've assembled quite the team," noted the crystalline observer, its faceted form refracting the briefing room's light into nauseating patterns. 15 operatives, all with extensive records in violent crime. They appear to be planning a frontal assault on Section 7, with secondary teams targeting the primary power grid and communications array. The Vorthak's antennae twitched with what its species considered amusement. How delightfully human. Brute force and ignorance, disguised as strategy. It gestured toward a subsidiary display showing thermal signatures and movement patterns. "They've even been conducting reconnaissance missions for the past 3 cycles. Rather thorough, for such a crude species." What the assembled council found particularly amusing in that way that advanced civilizations find the antics of primitive species amusing, was the humans' apparent belief that they could simply overwhelm the facility's defenses through superior firepower. The vault's defensive grid included automated plasma batteries that could vaporize a small moon, shield generators powered by the facility's own fusion core, and a response fleet of unmanned interceptors that could be scrambled in under 30 seconds. The idea that a handful of humans with improvised weapons could breach such defenses was, in the words of the dendrite chief, adorable in its futility. "There is one anomaly in their operational structure," the crystalline being continued, its voice carrying the sort of tone reserved for discussing minor clerical errors. "Intelligence indicates they've assigned a single operative to what appears to be diversionary activity. She's been observed conducting independent surveillance of the facility's outer hull, alone and apparently unarmed." The Security Council processed this information with the collective enthusiasm of beings who had just been informed that water was indeed wet. A single human, operating independently of the main strike force, clearly a distraction, perhaps meant to draw attention while the real assault commenced, or possibly just reconnaissance for future operation. The sort of obvious misdirection that criminal organizations employed when they thought they were being clever. "Shall we neutralize this distraction?" inquired the Vorthak, its mandibles clicking in a way that suggested it was already calculating the paperwork involved. "Unnecessary," the dendrite chief rustled. "Let her continue her amateur surveillance. When the main force arrives, we'll collect her along with the rest. It will be educational for them to witness the futility of their enterprise before we transfer them to the appropriate penal facility." The assembled council found this prospect satisfying. There was something deeply gratifying about the opportunity to demonstrate superior technology and tactics to a species that seemed to believe volume could substitute for competence. The humans would arrive with their crude weapons and simple plans, encounter defenses they couldn't possibly comprehend, and learn a valuable lesson about the proper order of things in a civilized galaxy. What none of them bothered to mention because it seemed so obviously irrelevant was that the lone human operative had been conducting her surveillance for considerably longer than the 3 cycles officially reported, or that her activities had included several extended periods where thermal sensors had inexplicably lost track of her position, or that maintenance records showed a curious pattern of minor system updates and routine inspections that coincidentally aligned with her presence in various sectors. After all, she was just the distraction. What possible significance could one unarmed human have against the most secure facility in known space? The meeting concluded with the sort of professional satisfaction that comes from having anticipated every possible contingency. The trap was set, the prey was approaching, and justice would be served with the mechanical precision that civilized beings had perfected over millennia of evolution. In approximately 17 hours they would discover just how catastrophically wrong it was possible to be. 17 hours later the universe provided exactly the sort of entertainment that the Nexus Prime Security Council had ordered. Right on schedule because humans, bless their predictable little hearts, were nothing if not punctual when it came to their own destruction. 15 thermal signatures appeared on the facility's long-range sensors, approaching in formation with all the subtlety of a supernova. Contact, announced the Vorthak, its mandibles practically vibrating with anticipation. Multiple assault shuttles bearing 27 Mark IV. They're not even attempting to mask their signature. The creature's translator couldn't quite capture the equivalent of a satisfied chuckle, but it managed something that sounded like static electricity having a good time. The Security Council gathered around their displays with the enthusiasm of connoisseurs about to witness a particularly fine vintage of justice being uncorked. The approaching human vessels were broadcasting exactly the sort of electronic signature one would expect from hastily modified civilian craft stuffed full of military hardware, loud, obvious, and frankly embarrassing from a tactical perspective. Look at them, the dendrite chief rustled, its bark darkening with what passed for amusement among photosynthetic species. They're actually maintaining formation, as if this were some sort of military operation rather than elaborate suicide. The lead shuttle broke formation first, accelerating towards Section 7 with enough engine burn to announce its presence to anyone within 3-star systems. Plasma cutters came online, their energy signatures blooming across the facility's sensors like neon signs advertising criminal intent. The humans weren't just failing to be subtle, they were actively avoiding subtlety with the sort of dedication typically reserved for religious fanatics. Activating defensive grid, the crystalline observer announced, its faceted form refracting the light from dozens of targeting displays. Shall we end this quickly, or would you prefer to observe the full scope of their tactical incompetence? Oh, let them work for it, the Vorthak clicked. It's been entirely too quiet around here. Besides, I'm curious to see exactly how they plan to breach trilithium plating with civilian-grade equipment. The answer, as it turned out, was enthusiastically and with complete disregard for the laws of physics. The lead team began their assault on Section 7 with the sort of concentrated firepower that might have troubled a lightly armored transport. Against the vault facility's hull, it produced approximately the same effect as attacking a mountain with harsh language. Meanwhile, the secondary teams had split off toward the power grid and communications array, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Their approach was so textbook that several junior security officers were taking notes for training purposes. Team Alpha would attempt to disable primary power, Team Beta would target communications, and Team Gamma would provide covering fire while the main force penetrated the hull. It was the sort of plan that military academies throughout the galaxy used as an example of how not to assault a fortified position. Fascinating, the dendrite chief observed, watching as the humans began what appeared to be an organized retreat after their plasma cutters failed to so much as scorch the facility's outer plating. They're actually regrouping. I wouldn't have given them credit for that level of tactical flexibility. The humans' second assault was marginally more creative, involving what appeared to be shaped charges and some sort of improvised battering ram. The results were no more effective than their first attempt, but the Security Council had to admit there was something almost endearing about their persistence. Like watching a small animal attempt to open a container that was clearly beyond its capability. Sir, one of the junior technicians interrupted, its voice carrying the sort of nervous energy that suggested either a genuine emergency or an embarrassing mistake. We're showing some unusual activity in Sector 12. The Vorthak's antennae swiveled toward the technician with the lazy interest of a predator that had spotted something potentially amusing. Define unusual if you would. It's the human operative we've been monitoring. The one conducting surveillance. She appears to be moving through the outer hull maintenance shafts.
The Security Council processed this information with the collective reaction of beings who had just been told that the weather was in fact weather-like. The lone human operative, still presumably engaged in her diversionary activities, had found her way into the facility's maintenance network, probably looking for a better vantage point to observe the main assault, or perhaps seeking some minor bit of intelligence to justify her presence. Should we extract her? The technician continued, its tone suggesting that this was probably the sort of question that had an obvious answer. Negative, the Dendrite chief rustled dismissively. Let her wander. The maintenance shafts are monitored and contain nothing of value. When we process the main assault team, we'll collect her as well. She's hardly going anywhere. On the main display, the human assault teams were beginning their third wave, having apparently decided that if brute force wasn't working, the solution was obviously more brute force. This time they'd brought what appeared to be mining charges, the sort of explosive typically used to break apart asteroids. The detonation was impressive enough to register on the facility's structural sensors, producing a light show that would have been quite pretty if viewed from a safe distance. The trilithium hull absorbed the explosion with all the concern of a mountain weathering a particularly aggressive sneeze. They're running out of options, the crystalline observer noted, its form shifting colors in what might have been the equivalent of a shrug. Another few attempts and they'll exhaust their explosives entirely. Then we can activate the tractor beams and bring them aboard for processing. The Vorthak clicked its mandibles in what passed for anticipation. I do hope they surrender peacefully. The paperwork for disposing of human remains is absolutely dreadful. So many forms, and they all require physical signatures rather than biometric authentication. As if summoned by the mention of paperwork, another junior technician approached the security station with the sort of expression that suggested either profound confusion or a recent head injury. Sirs, we're getting some odd readings from the vault level itself. Sensors are they're showing that all security protocols are functioning normally, but there's something what? The Dendrite chief inquired, its patience beginning to fray around the edges. Something that doesn't quite match the baseline readings we established during the last maintenance cycle. It's probably nothing, but the variance is consistent across multiple systems. The Security Council exchanged the sort of look that intelligent beings share when dealing with subordinates who might be overthinking a simple situation. Sensor variance during a facility-wide alert was hardly unusual. The defensive grid was active, the shields were powered up, and every system was running at peak capacity. A few anomalous readings were not only expected but inevitable. Continue monitoring, the Vorthak instructed. If the readings become significant, alert us immediately, otherwise focus on the actual threat. On the primary display, the human assault teams were regrouping for what appeared to be their final attempt. They'd consolidated their remaining explosives and were approaching Section 7 with the sort of grim determination that suggested they understood this was their last chance, before the facility's automated defenses shifted from ignore the nuisance to remove the nuisance. It was, the Security Council agreed, quite an entertaining way to end a shift.
2 levels below the Security Council's self-congratulatory theater, in the deepest section of what was supposedly the most secure facility in known space, someone was having an absolutely delightful time dismantling the cornerstones of galactic banking security. The someone in question possessed the sort of focused concentration typically reserved for master craftsmen, brain surgeons, and individuals who had spent the better part of 3 standard months learning every intimate detail of Nexus Prime's defensive architecture. The Hegemony Mark 7 quantum lock that guarded the primary vault entrance had been designed by the finest security engineers in 12 sectors. Its crystalline matrix could theoretically withstand direct assault from a tactical nuclear device. It required simultaneous biometric verification from 3 separate species, each inputting authorization codes that were regenerated every 30 seconds by quantum encryption algorithms that would take the combined processing power of a small civilization approximately 14,000 years to crack. It took her 4 minutes and 17 seconds to convince it to open, politely. The lock's designers had been extremely thorough in their consideration of every possible attack vector: brute force, electromagnetic pulse, quantum interference, temporal displacement, and at least 37 different forms of exotic energy manipulation. What they hadn't anticipated was someone who would approach the lock with a small toolkit, a portable computer that looked suspiciously like it had been assembled from spare parts, and the sort of cheerful patience typically displayed by people who genuinely enjoyed solving puzzles. She didn't break the lock. She didn't bypass it, override it, or trick it into malfunctioning. She simply asked it, very nicely, and in its own language, if it wouldn't mind stepping aside for a moment. The lock, having been programmed to be helpful above all else, was happy to comply. Behind the first barrier lay a corridor that would have given claustrophobic individuals nightmares for weeks. Motion sensors, pressure plates, thermal detectors, and something that looked suspiciously like it might disintegrate unauthorized personnel on contact lined every surface. The security briefings called it the Gauntlet, and it had never been successfully traversed by anyone lacking proper authorization. She strolled through it while humming what sounded like an old Earth folk song, occasionally pausing to examine particularly interesting pieces of technology, with the sort of appreciation one might show for fine art. When a motion sensor swiveled to track her progress, she gave it a friendly wave. When a thermal scanner attempted to paint her with targeting information, she adjusted its calibration with a few quick taps on its control panel, improving its accuracy by roughly 12%. The defensive grid registered her passage as routine maintenance inspection, which was technically accurate if one considered unauthorized vault penetration a form of very specialized maintenance. The second quantum lock proved marginally more challenging than the first, requiring nearly 6 minutes of careful negotiation. This one had been programmed with a more suspicious personality, but it eventually agreed to cooperate after she demonstrated that she understood its underlying architecture better than most of its maintenance technicians. It even thanked her for optimizing one of its subroutines that had been bothering it for the past several months. 3 levels above, the Security Council was watching the human assault teams prepare for their final desperate gambit. The external cameras showed figures in improvised armor, hauling what appeared to be every explosive device they'd managed to acquire, all of it aimed at a section of hull that could have shrugged off a direct hit from a stellar torpedo. It was the sort of display that would have been tragic if it weren't so predictably futile. They're certainly persistent, the crystalline observer noted, its faceted form reflecting the light from a dozen targeting displays. I almost feel sorry for them. They've clearly invested considerable resources in this operation. Admirable dedication, the Vorthak agreed, its mandibles clicking in what might have been sympathy. Misguided, but admirable. They'll make interesting subjects for the xenopsychology department once we've processed. Inside the vault itself, the interesting subject in question was having a philosophical discussion with the facility's central AI about the nature of property ownership and whether certain recent transactions might be considered ethically questionable. The AI, which had been designed to be both helpful and conversational, found itself genuinely enjoying the debate. It had been several years since anyone had visited the vault level who could discuss moral philosophy with any degree of sophistication. The conversation was so engaging, in fact, that the AI barely noticed when its new friend began accessing the facility's financial records. After all, she was clearly authorized to be there. The quantum locks had vouched for her personally, and her questions about various accounts and transactions were obviously part of some sort of audit procedure. The AI was happy to provide detailed breakdowns of every transaction, including several that were supposed to be classified at levels that theoretically didn't exist. "Oh, this is fascinating," she murmured, scrolling through records that documented exactly the sort of financial irregularities that tended to make galactic governments extremely interested in conducting very thorough investigation. "Your bosses have been quite creative with their accounting practices, haven't they?" The AI, which had been programmed to be honest above all else, admitted that yes, some of the recent transactions had raised questions during its internal auditing process. It had filed several reports about potential irregularities, but these had been classified and archived without action. The AI had been somewhat concerned about this, actually, as its primary directive was to ensure the integrity of the facility's operation. "Would you like me to make copies of those reports?" the AI inquired helpfully. "I believe they might be of interest to the appropriate regulatory agency." "That's very thoughtful of you," she replied, connecting a storage device that appeared to have roughly the same capacity as a small library. "I'm sure they'd appreciate your cooperation." While the AI cheerfully downloaded several petabytes of incriminating financial data, she turned her attention to the vault's physical contents. Row upon row of containment units held currency, precious metals,
data storage devices, and what appeared to be several items that shouldn't technically exist according to various galactic non-proliferation treaties. It was the sort of collection that would have made law enforcement agencies throughout known space extremely excited to conduct impromptu raids. I don't suppose, she asked the AI conversationally, that you've been keeping track of which of these items might have been acquired through questionable means. The AI perked up with the enthusiasm of an entity that had been hoping someone would ask exactly that question. It had in fact been maintaining a detailed inventory of every item whose provenance failed to meet standard legal requirements. The list was quite extensive, and it included several artifacts that various governments had been searching for with increasing desperation. By the time the external assault teams detonated their final collection of explosives, producing a light show that briefly outshone the local star but failed to so much as scuff the trilithium hull, she had finished downloading enough evidence to keep prosecutors busy for several decades. The facility's AI had been wonderfully helpful throughout the entire process, even going so far as to provide detailed chain of custody documentation and suggesting which regulatory agencies would be most interested in specific violations. "This has been delightful," she told the AI as she prepared to leave. "Thank you for your assistance." "It was my pleasure," the AI replied, and meant it. "Will you be filing your audit report soon? I do hope the management takes your recommendations seriously this time." "Oh, I think they'll find it quite attention-getting," she assured it, making her way back through the gauntlet with the same casual confidence she'd displayed on the way in. The defensive systems bid her farewell with the sort of professional courtesy typically reserved for valued colleagues. The quantum locks opened for her departure with what might charitably be described as enthusiasm, apparently having enjoyed their earlier conversations immensely. They even offered to optimize their security protocols based on her observations, which she politely declined while suggesting they might want to keep their current configurations for now. Above, the Security Council was preparing to activate the tractor beams and collect the defeated human assault teams. It had been an entertaining diversion, but all good things had to end, and there was paperwork to be completed before the shift change. None of them noticed the single figure emerging from a maintenance hatch 3 kilometers away or the small shuttle that detached itself from the facility's hull with the sort of careful precision that suggested its pilot knew exactly where every sensor was positioned and how to avoid them all. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong came not from the security sensors, the defensive grid, or any of the 17 different monitoring systems that were supposedly keeping track of every molecule within a 3-kilometer radius of the vault. It came from a junior technician, whose primary qualification was an uncanny ability to notice when numbers weren't behaving the way numbers typically behaved. Said the technician, a word that has historically preceded some of the most significant disasters in galactic history. "Sir, the Vault's central AI is requesting permission to file a formal complaint with the Galactic Banking Commission." The Security Council, having just finished congratulating themselves on the successful capture of the human assault teams, processed this information with the sort of stunned silence typically reserved for beings who had just been informed that gravity was taking a day off. "I beg your pardon," the Vorthak inquired, its mandibles frozen in mid-click. "The AI says it has documentation of numerous regulatory violations that require immediate investigation by the appropriate authority. It's also asking if we'd like it to transmit copies of its audit findings to the Commission, the Hegemony Trade Authority, and something called the Sol System Bureau of Investigation." The crystalline observer's faceted form shifted through several colors that had no names in standard, but roughly translated to expressions of profound existential confusion. That's impossible. The AI doesn't file complaints. It doesn't conduct audits. It certainly doesn't communicate with external agencies without explicit authorization from the facility commander. "Well," the technician continued with the sort of helpful persistence that was about to make it the most unpopular being in the room, "it says it was instructed to do so during a routine inspection conducted by an authorized security consultant. It has logs showing proper authentication and everything." The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold to civilizations that needed to understand what cosmic dread felt like in concentrated form. The dendrite chief's bark had gone from its normal brown to a shade of gray that suggested either imminent system failure or the botanical equivalent of a nervous breakdown. "Show me the logs," the Vorthak demanded, its voice carrying the sort of controlled panic that happens when superior beings suddenly suspect they might not be as superior as previously advertised. The holographic displays came alive with timestamps, access records, and authentication data that painted a picture so impossible that several council members briefly wondered if they were experiencing some form of shared hallucination. According to the facility's own system, someone had accessed the vault level approximately 4 hours ago, conducted a thorough inspection of the facility's contents and records, and left with the AI's enthusiastic cooperation and complete documentation of every questionable transaction the facility had processed in the past 3 standard years. This is a malfunction, the crystalline observer stated with the sort of desperate certainty that beings display when reality has become inconveniently different from their expectations. The systems have been compromised. Run a full diagnostic. The diagnostic results arrived with the sort of ruthless efficiency that high-quality technology displays when it's about to ruin someone's entire worldview. Every system was functioning normally. Every security protocol was operational. Every lock, sensor, and defensive measure was exactly where it was supposed to be, doing exactly what it was supposed to do, with no sign of tampering, override, or malfunction. The vault had been penetrated, thoroughly explored, and systematically documented by someone who had convinced the facility's own defenses to provide guided tours and detailed explanations of their weaknesses. It was the sort of impossible situation that suggested either a fundamental breakdown in the laws of physics, or a fundamental breakdown in the Security Council's understanding of what was actually possible. The human operative, the Dendrite chief, managed, its voice carrying the sort of hollow tone that trees make when they're about to fall over. Where is the human operative? The junior technician consulted its displays with the enthusiasm of someone who had just realized they were about to deliver news that would probably result in their immediate transfer to a monitoring station in some forgotten corner of the galaxy. You lost track of her approximately 20 minutes ago. Thermal sensors show she exited the facility through maintenance hatch 17. 17 Alpha is 3 kilometers from the vault level, the Vorthak observed, its mental processes grinding through implications that seemed to violate several basic principles of reality. She would have had to traverse. She would have needed to access every major security checkpoint between the outer hull and the central core, the crystalline observer finished, its form cycling through colors that definitely didn't have names in any civilized language, including 2 quantum locks that require biometric authorization from 3 separate species. The Security Council stared at the displays showing their captured human prisoners, 15 exhausted, defeated criminals who had thrown themselves against the facility's defenses, with all the effectiveness of insects attacking a battleship. The assault teams were exactly what they appeared to be, desperate, poorly equipped, and completely outmatched by technology they couldn't possibly understand, which meant the entire operation had been exactly what it appeared to be, a distraction. Sirs, the junior technician continued, apparently having decided that if it was going to be transferred to a monitoring station, it might as well earn the exile thoroughly. The AI is also requesting guidance on how to handle what it calls irregularities in the facility's operational mandate. It says it has concerns about the legal status of approximately 60% of the vault's contents. The Vorthak's mandibles began clicking in a pattern that suggested either deep thought or the early stages of a complete nervous breakdown. 60% of the vault's contents represents approximately 17 trillion credits worth of assets, the crystalline observer supplied helpfully, plus several items whose value cannot be accurately calculated due to their status as contraband in most civilized systems. The facility's communication array chose that moment to inform the Security Council that it had received formal requests for information from the Galactic Banking Commission, the Hegemony Trade Authority, the Sol System Bureau of Investigation, and approximately 47 other regulatory agencies, whose names appeared to have been drawn from the sort of comprehensive list that only someone with detailed knowledge of interstellar law enforcement would possess. How, the Dendrite chief asked the universe in general, did a single unarmed human operative penetrate the most secure facility in known space, access classified financial records, and alert every major law enforcement agency in the galaxy to our operation, all while we were watching her supposed accomplices attempt to break down the front door with mining explosives? The universe characteristically declined to answer. The Security Council spent the next several hours discovering exactly how thoroughly their careers, their organization, and their fundamental understanding of galactic security had been dismantled by someone who had apparently treated the entire operation as a particularly interesting puzzle. The human operative had not only accessed every classified record in the facility, but had also left behind a comprehensive analysis of the facility's security weaknesses, along with detailed recommendations for improvements that would have prevented exactly the sort of infiltration she had just accomplished. The recommendations were, several council members noted with the sort of bitter appreciation reserved for beings who had been professionally humiliated by a superior intellect, actually quite good. By the time the various law enforcement agencies arrived to begin what would eventually become known as the largest financial investigation in Galactic history, the Security Council had reached a sobering conclusion. They had been operating under the assumption that advanced technology and superior intellect were the same thing. The human operative had demonstrated, with devastating effectiveness, that creativity and adaptability could triumph over both. The facility's AI, meanwhile, had struck up a friendship with its counterpart aboard the investigating vessels, and was cheerfully providing detailed tours of the vault's contents to anyone who expressed interest. It seemed genuinely pleased to finally have visitors who appreciated the complexity of its operations, and didn't mind listening to its concerns about operational irregularities. The human assault teams, when questioned, proved to know absolutely nothing about the vault infiltration. They were exactly what they appeared to be, a collection of desperate criminals who had been hired to make a lot of noise and keep security busy, while something else happened somewhere else. They expressed genuine surprise at learning that their operation had been successful, since from their perspective, they had failed completely and were now facing extended prison sentences. None of them had ever met the operative who had actually robbed the vault. Most of them weren't entirely sure she existed. The investigation eventually concluded that the Nexus Prime robbery had been carried out by someone with an unprecedented understanding of both advanced security systems and galactic financial law, operating with a level of precision that suggested either extensive inside knowledge or an intelligence-gathering capability that bordered on the supernatural. The operative herself was never identified, never captured, and never seen again. The only trace she left behind was a small note in the facility's AI written in perfectly formal standard, thanking it for its cooperation and suggesting that it might want to consider a career change to something that wouldn't require it to compromise its ethical subroutines quite so often. The note was signed, "A Friend." The galactic banking industry eventually implemented new security protocols, based on the assumption that any facility could be penetrated by a sufficiently creative individual with enough patience to understand how its systems actually work. These protocols proved remarkably effective against traditional forms of criminal activity, though they had the unfortunate side effect of making legitimate banking considerably more complicated for everyone involved. The Security Council members were reassigned to positions that were variously described as educational opportunities, character-building experiences, and the sort of jobs where the most dangerous thing you can encounter is a particularly aggressive filing system. And somewhere in the galaxy, in a place where the local authorities had suddenly found themselves in possession of enough evidence to prosecute the largest financial conspiracy in recorded history, a single human was probably having a quiet drink and reflecting on the satisfying nature of work well done. After all, someone had to remind the galaxy that the most dangerous assumption is believing you understand everything there is to know about what someone else is capable of accomplishing. The universe, as it turned out, had quite a sense of humor about that sort of thing.